It's good to see you all once again. Appreciate you all being here this evening. As the title suggests, we're going to be in the book of Joshua tonight. So I'll open it to Joshua, the 23rd chapter. I did not intentionally plan it this way, but Providence would have us finish the book of Joshua in our daily Bible reading this week, right before we start Joshua 1, Wednesday night, for our Bible study. And if you have not yet picked up that material, it is in the lobby to the left on your way out. It's a little packet there. It's a self-guided study. And remember that we are starting Joshua 1 Wednesday night. Again, going to Joshua, the 23rd chapter tonight. We're not going to be going over Joshua's entire farewell address, but really just the first section of it, in which he gives his final counsel, his final advice to the nation of Israel. Underneath Joshua's leadership, Israel entered a period of, one of the rare periods of their history in which they were faithfully and utterly devoted to God. There were a few hiccups during the conquest, because they're human and there's prone to drifting. But you look at the periods of Israel's history in which they were faithful to God, they're very few and far between, and Joshua and the generation after Joshua is one of those periods in which they were totally devoted to their God. It's only when the generation that knew Joshua and knew the conquest passes away that the text says in Judges chapter 2 that there then arose a generation who knew not God nor the wondrous deeds that he had done for Israel. But even as we're here in chapter 23, which we might say is a zenith of the conquest, God has given them rest from their enemies on all sides. The land has been entered. The tribes are getting their allotments. Joshua actually has some pretty stern warnings and counsel that they need to heed and pay attention to if they want the good things to keep on coming. And so starting then in the 23rd chapter, we're going to read through verse 16, and we'll go back through and start breaking it down. Now it came about after many days, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old, advanced in years, that Joshua called for all Israel, for the elders and their heads and their judges and their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. See, I have appointed you these nations which remain as an inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations which I have cut off, from the Jordan even to the great sea, towards the setting of the sun. The Lord your God, he will thrust them out before you, and drive them from before you, and you will possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. Be very firm then, to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so you will not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. So you will not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations before you, and as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourself to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so as to associate with them, and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish off this good land which the Lord your God has given to you. Now behold, today I am going all the way of the earth, and you know in all your hearts and all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All has been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. It shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God has given to you. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from off the good land which he has given you. Joshua then goes into a review of Israel's history before the book closes and the narrative of the Judges begins. And if you just read the first chapter of Judges, things go pretty well, and then quickly, once we get to chapter 2, we begin the spiral of apostasy, cry out for deliverance, a deliverer is given, and on and on and on. But right before this happens, Joshua, knowing that his time is at hand, much like Moses and Aaron before him, takes the opportunity to give one last parting sermon, address. And the very first thing he reminds the nation of is that it was not them who did any of this. It was God who had done all these things for them. Now, you know as well as I do, that meant they had obedient, trusting faith. There we go. Then the qualifier was given. But you look here in the text, again, looking at verse 1, and verse 1 and 2, he's very old, he calls him old Gary, and he's look in verse 3. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. Now we might ask, well, wasn't that Joshua and the nations who were actually putting on the armor and fighting with the swords and so forth? Yes. But let's think about the conventional logic of this. A nomadic people who have no land, who have no military training, who have no standing army per se, who have nothing that would make for a intimidating foe. They're outnumbered, outgunned, outclassed. They have no professional generals, if you will. Going up against these city-states and these kingdoms in Canaan that have been fighting with each other for centuries, who have all these things, wealth and power and a standing army and training and so forth. By conventional wisdom says, no, they should not win whatsoever. And yet, what we see is, time and time again in the narrative of Joshua, is that the nation of Israel conquered overwhelmingly when the odds were not in their favor. Because it was God who was fighting for them. It was God who was putting the terror of them in the nations that surrounded them. We could think back to the day of the one battle of Joshua, which he knew that God was going to give him the victory that day, and the sun was setting. And Joshua concluded that, well, I can't win unless the sun's up. So we have the day of Joshua, in which God prolonged the daylight because Joshua knew, I need to win. God said I will win. I can't win if it's dark. Therefore, God's going to keep the sun up. That's how God was fighting for them. He was working miraculous things for their benefit. And Joshua is very quick to remind them of that fact. You did not do this. Your faithfulness to God is what, not cause, but God, your faithfulness to God and his word is the reason why God was doing these things. Because you were upholding your end of the covenant that he had made with their fathers. Again, just looking through this text here, through these first 5 verses, God had given them rest from their enemies in verse 1. God had executed justice on the inhabitants of the land, or vengeance, depending on your translation, in verse 3a. It had been God who was doing the fighting, the end of verse 3. And we look in verse 5, the Lord God, he will thrust them out before you and drive them before you, and you will possess their land just as the Lord your God promised you. Not only is his promises being fulfilled previously, but in the land that is yet still to be conquered. There is the assurance that just as God has been with you thus far, he will continue to do these great things that he has done for you. If we just look back very quickly at even Joshua and Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 30, before they get ready to go into the land at the second giving, here we have the generation that had not rebelled in the wilderness. This was the generation that was born in the wilderness. They are given the law, and God says there in Deuteronomy 1 and verse 30, that the Lord your God who goes before you, he himself will fight on your behalf, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. God was already telling them ahead of time, I'm going to fight for you. And now they're conquered the land. It says, I have fought for you. They could see the promise and the fulfillment. In Joshua chapter 13 and verse 6, God again reminds them of the promise that he was going to give them the promised land. He says there in Joshua 13, verse 6, all the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon as far as the region there, and all the Sidonians, I will drive them out before the sons of Israel, only allotted to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. And really when we start, and as you've begun your study of Joshua, and as we study through Joshua, this is a major theme throughout the entire book. You look at the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Throughout those 5 books, the promises of God keep on bringing up. God has promises, God has promises, God has promises. The land promise is the big one. The nation promise that God gave to Abraham in Genesis 15. Joshua is all about, okay, God promised it. It's been fulfilled. God has kept his word. The promises are coming true. God is fulfilling his word. That gets emphasized over and over and over again in the narrative of Joshua, that the Lord keeps his word. And Joshua is reminding the nation of that right now in this section. And I believe that this is just Joshua keeping in mind what the book of Deuteronomy said in chapter 9 and verse 4. God said to them before they even entered the land, even before they came near the Jordan, he said in Deuteronomy 9 verse 4, do not say in your heart, when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. But it's because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. This is meant to keep Israel humble. God is the reason why they were standing there in that day. And this gets up to why this next section of the text, Joshua does what he does. See, this whole counsel, if you will, this whole chapter, is really about the need for greater diligence in time and in spiritually good times. We often think that when we're going through conflict and we're fighting through temptation, we're in the trenches, that's when we need greater vigilance. We're in the thick of it. But it's actually when things are going really well that we have to be even more vigilant. Because, as we just read in Deuteronomy 9 and verse 4, God is recognizing there that there's going to be a period of prosperity, of peace on the land. And before they even shed 1 ounce of blood to conquer the land, God reminds them, now when I've given you peace on all sides, and when all of you have possessed your lands and all the allotments are given and you have erected your houses and so forth, do not think you had anything to somehow earn, you earned this somehow. Do not think that somehow you have arrived and you've made it and so now you can kind of let your guard down. I am driving out these nations from before you because of their wickedness. And the fact that I am judging these nations should be there was an implied lesson for Israel to learn there as well. If God would drive out these nations from the land and give it to another nation, he would sure as well do the same thing to Israel, which, preview coming attractions, end of the address, Joshua says as much. He repeats the warnings and the curses that God gave with the covenant. So what does Joshua say then? Joshua gives them really a couple pieces of advice of how they can maintain and still enjoy the goodness of this time period and continue to enjoy God's blessings. In short, and we're going to break it down, but this is the tongue-in-cheek answer, keep doing the things you were doing to make it good times. The ancient Greeks had a saying, good times create soft men create bad times create strong men create good times. It was a never-ending cycle of what happened. Prosperity bred complacency bred it made the makings of war and economic distress, which people who go through those periods, who grow up in those periods, they tend to be more rugged and tougher in a relative sense. And it's those who appreciate what they had create the good times. And it goes on and on. Joshua's trying to prevent them from getting into this cycle, if you will. But it's the times of spiritual triumph, success, or just in general spiritual good times, we have to be on guard. So let me explain this a little bit further. These are the times perhaps you're feeling really excited. You're feeling really excited spiritually. Bible studies, joy. You feel that instead of being in the trenches of warfare, you're kind of only having skirmishes. It seems that the temptations are at bay. You're doing good. You're coming to all the services. You might even be sharing the gospel with somebody. You feel like, okay, I'm doing great, doing really great. Maybe I can skip Wednesday night. Everything's going pretty good. Everything's going pretty good right now. Frank wants me to go golfing Monday morning. I can do Bible reading later that day. That'll be fine. It sneaks in. And sometimes I'm convinced that Satan will lay off you for a season to get you in that false sense of security. So he can come in and rip out the rug from under you. And I think we see that, not with the generation immediately after Joshua, but the generation after that one. They had 2 generations of good, peace, prosperity, of devotion to God. And what happened? That 3rd generation was the one that arose who knew not God, nor the wondrous deeds that he'd done for Israel. So what's Joshua's counsel? So as he reaffirms that just as the Lord God promised you in verse 5, he says then in verse 6, be very firm then to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so you may not turn aside from it to the right or to the left. What's the funny thing about public schools in Oregon? They're always trying to experiment with the latest and greatest ways of teaching, which are not the latest and they're not the greatest. Give you a sampling. Because of the age differences between me and my 2 siblings, 2.5 years between me and my sister, 6 years between me and my brother, we all went through a different junior high based on how they were teaching. And when I went to high school, they implemented something called Proficiency Grading, in which 90% of your grade came from tests, 10% from everything else. Worked great the first year until we all figured out, I could still get an A and not do any work. I just had to show up for the test. And what was even more moronic, the teachers, per the grading system, had to give you opportunities to keep on taking the test. Had to. And it made more work for teachers because they had to come up with different versions of the test. Now I'm going to tell you this next one, not because I was abusing the system, it's because math is not my forte. Quadratic formulas in Algebra 2. I took that test 8 times in one day. And for the rest of high school, I had memorized the quadratic formula, and I could do quadratics. Do not ask me after services because I can't do it anymore. But I bring this up because, my brother had to suffer through an all-digital junior high experience. The district was making the kids all use iPads, and here's the kicker. You had to pay a rental fee. So, why am I talking about this? Why is this randomly being brought up? They're always trying to find the latest and greatest things, and then they scratch their heads like, why are test scores failing? Why are kids hating school? Why? All that other stuff. When we already know how education works. We've been doing it for centuries. A teacher shares the information, students take notes, you might have a verbal exam or something to figure out what's going on. In my college classroom, my history department even said, because I had a class where I got a grade myself. Okay? That's the lunacy that's going on right now. My history department said, no. You guys will sit there, we will lecture, you will take a midterm and a final, and you'll get your grade. And those were the classes I enjoyed the most because they were structured and it worked because we've been doing it for centuries. I'm rambling here at this point, but getting back to this, here's the point. We tend to think there's got to be a quicker, easier, faster way to godliness and righteousness. And there isn't. It's simply doing the things that work day in and day out. And that in itself can be a challenge. But simple things. God made it simple for us for a reason. Engagement with the Word. Prayer. Helping others. That's what we covered that a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, on Wednesday night with Elijah. Elijah was having a pity party. And what did God have him to do? Take a nap, eat a snack, and I have a new mission for you. Go help somebody. You got to do more preaching. So pay close attention to the Word. There's all been sorts of crazy fads that have come up in spirituality. I can't tell you how many trash articles are out there of like 3 easy steps to achieve victory over sin. Or, we love these 3 or 5 or 10 easy steps or points or hacks or whatever. That's the current phrase, hacks. When really, if you want to keep on and having spiritually good times, you have to keep on doing the things that work. Engagement with the Word. Worship in the community of believers. Engagement with brethren and talking about the Word of God. Again, praying alone and with others, the things that God has already said. So Joshua's not giving them anything new in this section. He's just reminding them this is what works because God designed it to work this way. You think back in Deuteronomy chapter 6 of God's instructions to the parents. The words of this law shall be on your mouth, and you shall teach it to your children when you raise up, and when you sit down, when you walk by the way. It shall be as frontals on your forehead, and it shall write on your doorposts and on your walls. God's saying just talk about it. Read it. Engage with it. And we really are spoiled today because, I did the right thing. I left the cell phone in the pew. You can get digital Bibles. You can get audio Bibles. You can get the dramatic narrative Bibles. They have the Max McLean audio Bible. If you have a CD player, I think there's a James Earl Jones one. You can have Darth Vader read you the Bible. There you go. There's all sorts of ways you can engage with the Word today. And it's great. And this is going to, I know I sound like a broken record on this, but this is where godliness, this is where righteousness, this is where devotion, where it all begins. There's no way around it. There's no way to circumnavigate it. That's why Derek Kidner, in his commentary on the Psalms, said a big part of righteousness is simply dogged attention to familiar truths, of never losing sight of those things. But that's not the only thing he said. He says in verse 7, he says you need to pay attention to the Word in verse 6, so you will not drift from it to the left nor to the right. Verse 7, so that you will not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. It's pretty straightforward from the law standpoint. These were the nations that were forbidden for having any sort of association or connection with, or intermarriage and so forth. But on much more broader level, they represented influences and desires that would take Israel away from God. And the application for us, again, is also rather straightforward. Not only, if we want to be wise and righteous, it begins and ends with the Word. We have to be in the Word daily, in different ways, in different lengths of time, constantly poring over the text, praying about it, thinking on it, meditating on it. But it's not just simply for knowledge's sake. It's to have that knowledge and apply it. A knowledge of the law of Moses for the Israel in their day would have naturally resulted in understanding to steer clear and avoid those things that would pull them away from God and their service. New Testament's not without its own applications. Paul said in the 1 Corinthian letter in chapter 15 and verse 33, "Be not deceived, bad company corrupts good morals." I know as a new convert, as a teenager, I thought, there was 2 things I thought were the dumbest things I ever heard from the Bible as a non-believer, non-Christian. When Jesus said, "He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me," I remember as a 14-year-old sitting in a church building thinking, well, that just sounds really ridiculous. Who would believe that? Again, what did I know? And 1 Corinthians 15:33. Well, they're just friends. They really can't influence me that much, can they? Boy, was I wrong again. But when you start hanging around people for a long length of time, you don't realize how much you pick up from them. You look at a friend group, they will start using the same jargon, the same language. There's a reason we have something called inside jokes. They're things that make no sense to anyone else, but because of a certain incident in that friend group, it's hilarious. The worst thing in my history class in college, my lecture hall, it was worse for everybody else because there was four. Cameron, me, Michael, and James Gallardo. All of our laughs started to sync up. And Michael's had a loud belly laugh, and so that's the one that won. It started all sound the same. But even on a more serious level, what your friends tolerate, what your friends engage in, you yourselves will engage in and just begin to tolerate. It's like that old illustration. There's a young lady who's engaged to a non-Christian, and he shows no interest whatsoever in God or the Bible or anything else like that, and hasn't been to services, none of that. And so the preacher's given some counseling on this, and she's convinced that she can raise above and be the better influence. And he goes, that might be true, but, let me just show you something. And he pulled out a little stool he had in his office, he sat on it, and he was a larger preacher. He said, okay. And she tried. This man's, again, like I said, larger. Can't do it. He goes, okay, my turn. Grabs her arm and just barely yanks. She falls to the ground. It is easier to pull somebody down to your level than for you to hoist them up to yours. And so when it comes to our friends and our associations, who we spend our precious free time with, I would just ask, all of us just ask ourselves, are these people, are they sharpening me? Are they helping me improve? Do I like who I am when I'm around them? Or are they pulling me down to a level I don't want to go? And second thing is what Jesus said in Matthew 6 and verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body, so then if the eye is clear, the whole body will be full of light. The media we consume, books, television, social media, video games, there is no such thing as, well, let me rephrase this. The excuse of it's just a movie, it's just a book, it's just a game, doesn't hold water. Let's take the movie thing just real quick. It's just a movie. No, it's not. It's a multi-million-dollar piece of art that somebody had a very intentional message and plot that they poured themselves into. You can't divorce that from it. Subtle things. So one illustration of this and we'll move on. The big reason why the Obergefell decision became reality, the one that granted marriage rights to all same-sex marriages and along with heterosexual. And the reason why that happened so quickly, has been cited in several studies, was popular television. It started with late 80s introducing characters who are homosexuals. And then it went on to shows like Will and Grace, that was the whole premise of the show, really. And then you started having couples on television. And what it did was, it made America just basically, we're seeing that, and people who aren't grounded in the scripts like, well, what's wrong with that? Because it was put in front of millions of Americans' face week after week after week at primetime television. And that same thing can be said for premarital sex, drug and alcohol usage. Throw a dart at anything you want and what you want to say as far as things that we would consider immoral or improper. It's been on television. It's been in the movies. To where PG-13 doesn't mean what it used to be. I'm actually kind of shocked what gets away in those type of films anymore. But this is all the point, that we have to guard against what we watch, what we consume, what we intake. Because by the time we realize it might be influencing us, it's been influencing us for years probably at that point. These are very subtle shifts that happen. And so what is the application, the implication then, if we are to cling to the Word or be diligent to the Word and not associate with things that would pull us away from God? Look what Joshua says here in verse 8. In contrast to not worship the idols, he says, but you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. To Joshua's point, he was chosen as the next leader after Moses died. The generation that he led into the land of Canaan to conquer it was the generation born in the wilderness. They were the generation who was raised up. They knew nothing but the law. They knew nothing but the relationship with God. They were, as a whole, totally devoted. They had clung to God. In fact, when you look in the book of Joshua, when the two tribes beyond the river, when they're finally released to go back after they had fought, they erect an altar, not to worship, but as a monument, so that the tribes across our side of the Jordan would remember that they're part of the nation too. Well, the other tribes think they're trying to set up an altar to an idol, and a civil war almost breaks out. Now, it gets very quickly cleared up. I bring that up because it showed that Israel there was very concerned about what God had said about not going after idols. That they were willing to destroy two of their own tribes because it looked like they were doing that. You don't find that happening after the period of Judges, or even during the period of Judges. You don't find that happening in the reign of Solomon or David or Saul. You have a period of history where they are totally devoted. The Christian Standard Bible words this verse as, instead, be loyal to the Lord your God as you have been to this day. So for us, if we find ourselves in spiritually good times, take note of the things that we're doing that are right. And really, the advice here is keep doing what you've been doing. Paul said as much as that in Philippians, where he said, excel still more. They were already doing great. He said, continue to do those things. Continue to press on. And the reason Joshua gives in verse 9 is that the reason why you cling to the Lord, pay attention to his word, and abstain from these influences is a reminder of the promises. It's because God has driven out great and strong nations from before you. And as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. Verse 10, one of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves and to love the Lord your God. I love this section because Joshua starts with a reminder of the promises. He makes some applications based on because God is always faithful and true, and he always fulfills his word. So there's some implications. Avoid the things that will pull you away from him, and be utterly devoted to him. Because he's a God who fulfills his word, is what he just said there. But then we get into the warnings, which Israel needs to hear. For if you ever go back, he says in verse 12, and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so you associate with them and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your side and thorns in your eyes, until you perish off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now, it almost seems like Joshua is anticipating an objection or somebody say, but yeah, what about... Because he says in the next verse, now behold, today I am very old, and I'm going to die soon. But you know in all your hearts and all your souls that not one word of the good things which God has spoken has failed to come to pass. That's what he's saying. You know already that when God speaks good, it comes to pass. It always happens. So he says in verse 15, so you better be sure that if all good things God says comes to pass, all his warnings and curses and bad things will also come to pass. He's not faithful in only one area of God we're serving. He's faithful in all his words. And so just as he had repeated, he repeats again then. He said in end of verse 15, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you off this good land which he has given you, when you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and you go and serve other gods. Excuse me. That was already open. Into verse 16. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly off the good land which he has given you. Now Joshua then will go and review Israel's history. But really, he ends his address with this warning. God has been blessing you. You have been keeping the covenant. You need to continue to be diligent, to observe the law, to keep it, to worship God alone, and serve him always. But you need to be reminded that even though things are going well now, if you were to ever shirk back, if you were to turn your back, if you were to go and worship the other gods, remember all those curses we pronounced when we entered the land. You know, I almost see Joshua going, remember how half of you stood on one mountain and the other half of you stood on the other mountain, and these guys said the blessings and these guys said the curses? If you're disobedient, those curses are going to happen. All the plagues, all the terrors, everything. And really what Joshua's doing is calling everyone here, the nation, back to continued covenant loyalty with their God. As part of covenants in the ancient world were, if you reneged, where you went back on your part of the covenant, most covenants were your life was forfeit. But it wasn't just a contract. It was a solemn pledge. You did not enter covenants lightly. And believers of no matter which covenant they live under do not enter the covenant with God lightly. And so for us today, we need to remind ourselves that spiritually good times are occasions for greater faithfulness, not laxity. In fact, I did not anticipate to say this, I didn't even think about it until now, but as things are returning to normal after the last 2 years, let's not lose the zeal that perhaps was born during that adversity. That yes, the masks and whatever are gone and COVID's no longer talked about on the news. That doesn't mean that we should simply go back to our old patterns of showing up and warming the pew. Not saying any of you here were doing that. But now's not the time to simply go back to what we did previously. Now's the time to double down and increase in our devotion and diligence and our exercising of our faith and our work and all those good things. Because there has been a lot of explosive growth spiritually speaking here. Trials bring about greater faith. That's what James says. And we can continue to grow that faith if we continue to press on doing the things that we know work and that we know bring God's favor. I look out tonight that I think most of us are believers, have obeyed the gospel. Perhaps there's one here tonight who has not yet put on Christ in baptism. Jesus said in Mark 16, verse 16, the one who believes in him and is baptized shall be saved. The one who does not believe shall be condemned. But I think more pertinent to the group here tonight, if there is sin in your life that needs confessing, or you're going through struggles and you need prayers of encouragement, prayers of strength, we can assist you at this time. We can pray with you, we can pray for you, but we can only do so if you come, as here we stand and sing the song that's been selected.